Okay guys, so moving forward to add a first person camera into the scene. We've already got a third person camera, so I've added a few things from when we last saw it. So I've renamed our third person camera to TP camera. That contains our third person camera script, and I've added a new camera into our scene and called it first person. This is just default at the moment, there's no changes been made. And I've also added two new scripts in, a change point of view script and a first person camera script. So let's jump straight into those and let's start adding some functionality. Okay, so to start with, in the change point of view script, this is fairly straightforward. It's basically just a toggle between both of the cameras. So if we add in our variables to begin with, we're going to use a game object for the first person and third person cameras, so we'll allocate those cameras manually. We're going to use a boolean value to switch between the two, and we're going to need access to both scripts for the first person and third person. We're going to initialize the scripts. We're not going to do that through start. We're actually going to call the initialize from our third person input, but we'll drop it in now, and we'll complete this this script now because there's only a few functions in it. So our initialize script is essentially just going to be getting both of the objects, setting the third person, so we're going to start in third person to true, the first person to false, and then setting our boolean value so we know where we are. After that, the only other function that's going to be in here is an update function, which is essentially going to be looking for a key down to switch between both cameras. So if I drop that in, I've hard coded this to key code R. You can hard code it to whatever you'd like, it doesn't matter. Or in fact you could use the same functionality that we've used up here, so that will actually show in the inspector in a drop down, so you can change it if you wish. I've just taken a bit of a shortcut and hard coded it there just to show that there's several different ways you can do these things. Our third person initialize should already work. Let's have a quick look at. Okay, cool. So I've used a capital. Let's just fix that quickly. And that should pull through. Maybe I need to save it. Okay, I also made this private, so the change point of view won't actually be able to see it. So for this to work, I'm going to need to change this to public. So two little mistakes there, but now that should pull through. There we go, and that can see it. The first person one isn't written yet, so we'll go over and write that in just a moment. But to start with, there's also some changes that we're going to actually need to make to the third person inputs and also to the character controller, but we'll come to that last as that's a little bit more involved. So firstly, the third person inputs. To start with, the first changes that we need to make are up in the declarations. So we're actually going to need, in much the same way as we've done the third person camera, we're going to need access to all of the cameras. So we're going to need the first person camera, and we're also going to need the change point of view. So we're going to need to grab both of those. And in the same way that we've done the other allocations in the start function here, we're also going to do the first person camera, and we're going to do the change point of view. So we're just going to grab both of those. And at the same time, while we're here, this is actually a really good point because this is one of the first things that actually runs in the game to initiate the cameras and make sure that we've only got one audio listener in the scene. Otherwise you're going to start getting loads of errors if you initiate it either too late or definitely if not at all. So we'll call that POV initiate, which is just going to run which is going to run this. There we go, we'll get there in the end. Okay, so third person input. So we've initiated the cameras, so we now only have one in show. If we do flick between them, they are going to run independently of one another. So the camera input at the moment, if we find it, this here won't be able to run because it's going to be trying to run a third person camera, which is going to be in here be set to not active. So we're going to need to write in using the Boolean value from the change point of view, just a simple if statement to use one or the other. So I've actually got that pre-written. Also, this is going to have to come in as well because we're passing the third person camera into this. So if we take both of those and just wrap them up into an if function, so we're going to check to see if we're in first person or not. If we are, we're going to run this. If we're in third person, we're going to run this. So we're passing through the right camera to the right areas. Again, the first person camera for rotate isn't written yet, but we're going to be moving on to that in just a second. I think that's it for the third person input and the change point of view, so all fairly straightforward up to now. Let's move forward to the first person camera and get some functionality inside of here. So what you'll find inside of here is there is quite a lot of similarity to a degree to the third person camera in terms of some of its basic variables and stuff, but because it's its own entity and it works in its own way, we don't want to be changing variables for the third person camera if we've got that working just as we want to make the first person camera work as we want. So for example, if I paste these in, they'll share a target, but they're obviously going to have their own version of their own object. Equally, if we're in first person and we want the camera to move quicker, we can independently change the mouse sensitivity. The night vision I've kept in there as a value at the moment. We will get to that. That's going to come into play when we have a little bit of a mess around with the shaders in a bit. So that's a bit of a teaser as to what's to come with the shader. Obviously we're going to need the character height, so we're going to need to know where his head is, so that's going to be our height value. Standard rotation limits, they're a little bit wider than they were for the third person, and obviously a smooth camera rotation so we're not jumping all over the place. So to move on to our start function, so the thing that's going to run straight away as soon as we kick off, let's create a bit of space. So we're going to get our component for the camera so we can actually reference it, and the first thing we're going to do, because we're actually placing the camera directly inside the guy's head when we run our initialize in a moment, we're going to actually hide the player. So we're going to actually place the player behind a culling layer using a bit and operator, so that the camera doesn't actually render the player at all. If we don't do this, with how the models are made, we end up seeing kind of teeth and eyes and things like that kind of clipping into the scene, and it kind of ruins the experience a little bit. So we're just going to stop that from rendering to the camera completely. Cool. So once that's all set, we can run our initiate function. So let's just grab that and drop that in. This is basically just putting the camera in the right place and defaulting our values. So pretty straightforward in comparison to the third person. We're pretty much just dumping our camera where it needs to be, aligning it to our target in the right place, and we're setting our default mouse and X and Y values to the target Euler angle. So we're completely lined up with where we need to be. In the third person inputs, we had the rotate camera function, which we don't have yet. So let's go ahead and drop that in. This is pretty much exactly the same as the function that's in third person, but because we're passing through a different camera, it just wouldn't be able to read it. Also, this references the same extensions file as the third person camera, so once again we need to scroll up and make sure that we actually include that namespace. Using camera extensions. There we go. Okay, perfect. So that will clamp the angle nicely, and that should all work wonderfully. So now we just need to actually move the camera around as we did before with third person. Again, much more straightforward than the third person camera, because you're pretty much just on top of the player. So again, we're just going to check to see if there is a target before we do anything, and then if we're good to go, we're going to start the camera movement function. So let's get that one in. Okay, so the camera movement function is just going to basically take the rotations from the mouse inputs, and we're going to transform our position to the correct place on our player, and then we're just going to add those rotations to our camera and to our player. So whenever we move our camera, we want our player to face the right direction and also our camera to go in the right direction. And that's pretty much it. It's really straightforward for first person. So that pretty much completes what we need to do in the first person camera. The difficult bit then comes in the character controller. We need to break apart how our character moves. At the moment, the character only moves in a forward position, and if we press, say for example, the right key, we run forward to the side, which is fine in third person, but in first person, if you press right and that happens, it's suddenly going to spin 90 degrees and you're going to start running forwards while pressing right. It's going to look really strange. So instead of free movement, what we technically want to be doing is to strafe instead. Obviously we don't need to worry about animation because you're not going to see our character. We've already bitmasked him out of even that being possible. So we just need the functionality to actually be able to do this. So right at the very top, there's a few things that we're going to need. To start with, we are going to need a Boolean value to actually check to see if we are strafing or not. So these can, instead of just kind of adding public bool each time, we can just drop these down, add in is strafing, comma, and just kind of list them out like that, maybe a little tidier. So we need an is strafing, and we also need access to the change point of view script to double check and see what camera we're actually in. So down here we'll drop it in under the components. Okay, so now if we go down to our free movement, we can actually break this apart a little bit, because this chunk at the bottom here is pretty much used in both to a degree, or certainly some of it. So what we're going to do is we're actually just going to take this chunk out of our free movement, and we're going to change that for a move player function instead, which is going to hold the actual physical moving for both the third person and the first person. So all of this bit up above that is sorting out what the value should be, and then the move player is actually going to be doing the physical moving of the player, and calculating the final velocities. So let's add our move player function in so that we get rid of that error. Excuse me. So you'll recognize the velocity, you'll recognize the let's change that so it's actually a proper variable. You'll recognize the velocity, you'll recognize the vel y that we've done before. A new one that we've added in is the velocity for x, which is, instead of speed, direction, which we've already got a variable for. We added it in right at the start, but we've not done anything with it yet, and we'll do something with that when we come to strafing. And all this is now doing, this is what the free movement was doing before. If we're in first person, however, what we're going to do is we're actually going to allocate X and Y individually as opposed to just a velocity times speed against a transforms forward. So this will allow us to move on these axes individually. And Y is always going to remain as Y, we're not going vertically in any way. And then we're just going to apply that to our rigid body velocity. So that will allow us to move in a strafing manner. This will always have an impact on our transforms forward. Okay, so that gives us our player move. Now all we need is the strafing. So to be able to strafe, again, doesn't require much code. This is the strafing function, and it's basically taking the speed from the Y of our vector2 input and the direction from the X. It's allocating those to our predefined variables. It's adding the sprinting as we've seen before. It's basically saying if we're going in a direction too much, so we're kind of pushing all the way down on the strafing, we don't want to be sprinting going sideways. Or of course our speed drops below 0.1, then we don't want to be sprinting anymore. Okay, and then we're just going to move our player, so we're back down into this function that we've explained before, and that's pretty much it. We do need to update our motor around this free movement, otherwise it's only ever going to call free movement. So again, a basic if statement around this, using our point of view boolean that we've already got in place, and that will solve it. So if we're in first person, we're going to run our strafe movement, and otherwise we're going to run our free movement. So that should be everything that we need to do to be able to get a switch between first and third. So let's go back into our Unity. We need to apply our first person camera to script to our camera. We then need to apply our transform to our target, and our change point of view. No, that gets pre-populated. Okay, cool. So that should be it. Okay, I've missed something. Let's check and see what that is. Okay guys, thanks for bearing with me. There were a few things that we missed, nothing major. The first being on your swapped character. The change point of view does need to go in, but it goes in as a component. And that's where we assign our third person camera and our first person camera. So that allows us to switch between the two. And also if we go into our script for camera controller, we are trying to see here if the point of view is first person or not, but we forgot to actually assign the point of view script. So in here we also need to get that component so that we can actually see that value. The only other thing I believe was the occlusion on the character. So on the first person camera we put a culling mask over the layer called player, and I don't believe we've actually assigned that to our player. Oh yeah, cool, perfect. Alright, so make sure that's assigned, and make sure it's assigned to all the children. And then if we click play, there we go, we've got movement. Okay, perfect. So now we have a fully moving character, third person camera with wall occlusion, and if we press R, we flick to first person, we move around in the same way. And if we press R again, we flick back to third person. Excellent. Once again guys, thanks for watching, and hopefully you'll join me in part 4 for some fun with shaders.